So I'm Dr. Rawari Waratini Karina. I'm from Te Whare Wānanga o Awanuirangi Indigenous University in Whakatane. I teach PhD postdoc. I'm a post-research fellow. After Christopher Columbus, 1492, sailed the ocean blue, he went to the Caribbean and pretty much decimated the Taino people there. But he brought back slaves, and he said that that was the place of milk and honey, that the land was paved with gold. And so European emissaries wanted to emulate what Christopher Columbus did. And so what they did was they started to go to see indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. They wanted to establish trade. But when they got there, they found other European emissaries, or other European ambassadors. And what they wanted to do was they didn't want to fight amongst each other. So they set up a series of guidelines. And they needed legal tenet to justify it. And so they went to the most powerful organisation at the time. And the organisation was the Catholic Church and the Pope. And so the Pope sent out a series of papal bull decrees. A papal bull is an official declaration of the Pope to determine the process of engaging with indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. And I'll give you a couple of them. One is called Romanus Pontifex, 1455. And it said this: if you get to indigenous lands and the indigenous people there were not Christian, then they were justified in invading, vanquishing, subjecting, reducing to perpetual slavery, and to have their properties and possessions seized by the European monarchs. Another one is Taranalis, 1493, and it says this: if a European power goes to a European land, it says this: if a European power finds land and the land is inhabited, that European power can claim it. However, if there are indigenous people there and they were not Christian, as a result, they did not have entitlement to land. They only had rights of occupancy. And what that meant was this: their status as a human was lowered to that as a tree, as a deer, as a hedgehog. So they were considered to be flora and fauna. When most people hear about these things, they think, well, that's happened in the 14th century. When the United people in New York, they were sent, people said that they had to pay rates on their land. And they went and challenged the state, and they said, wait a minute, we were here before you. Well, they actually won their case. But it was appealed and it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favour of the state as a result of Taranalis 2007. And so what that inadvertently highlights is they're still using the papal bull decrees. They're still using Taranalis. They're actually still using Romanus Pontifex. That's what's happening in Iraq. That's what's happening in Afghanistan. That's what's happening in Libya. It all stems from Romanus Pontifex, 1455.
My name's Tanya Gilchrist. I'm a descendant of Ngāti Porou people. So Hikurangi is our mountain and Waiapu is our awa, and Te Whānau Atu Whakairiora is my hapu. Captain Cook tried to indoctrinate Māori into seeing that Europeans were superior. Christianity is the tool of the coloniser, essentially. Go in and we pacify the natives, and then we can come in and do what we want to them. It's a really interesting one because I grew up in a very religious family. I had a very strong faith growing up. I realise now that that's just my innate spirituality as an Indigenous person, needing an outlet or a framework to wrap itself around.
So my name is Jamaica Haolam Kalani Osorio. I'm a Kanaka Maoli Wahine from the island of Oahu, which is in Hawaii. And I am an assistant professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So the United States government illegally overthrew Hawaii in 1893. staged a faux annexation in 1898. So by all intents and purposes, there are past and current colonizer. And today they operate the fake state of Hawaii under which we Hawaiians continue to live. The way that colonization has worked kind of most visibly, I think, in Hawaii has a lot to do with our land being, our people being displaced from our land base. So, of course, the United States operating as if they have jurisdiction over our land, one is an oppressive act against us. So that the displacing us from our language and our traditional practices is, of course, oppression against us. The institution of marriage and the way that they've kind of insidiously pushed us into relating to each other through those institutions is also oppression against us. So, like any other Indigenous people, our oppression is complicated and nuanced and multifaceted. But our people are also incredibly resilient and strong, and so we've been making really big strides towards decolonization and in creating a better and more just future, I think, for us as Hawaiians, which is pretty exciting.
If you look around us and you see universities and education and all those sorts of things, people might go, oh, it's been all right. But it's come at an enormous cost. Colonization cost us our language, cost us our culture, cost us our land. It's still costing us. It's costing us our babies. It's costing us our families. It's not been great. Because, the assumption is that we wouldn't have found these things like the written word or textiles or technology without colonization. But those things were happening in the world anyway, and we would have found our way to them, or they would have found our way to us. And again, it comes back to, why did these things have to cost us our land and our culture and our lives? It shouldn't have done that. If we'd been left alone to develop and grow as a nation, in relationship with these other cultures, we'd be in a much different place.
My name is Sandra Yellowhorse, and I am Towering House People from the Diné Nation in the United States. The U.S. government and European Americans originally colonized the United States. What I look at in my work is the role of the U.S. government and how they have formatted education and have co-opted our processes of knowledge production. And so I look at the way that colonization takes place structurally within U.S. educational systems, and that includes looking at U.S. policy and law, and looking at the ways that Indigenous people are still fighting to try to understand and push back against what the U.S. government sees as the standards of knowledge production, what counts as knowledge. And so we're really pushing back against Western ideas of what is knowledge, how do people live in our society, what the goals of our lives should be. And so when I think about colonization, I think about it as a social structure in many ways, a political and a social structure that's still impacting how we raise our children, that's still impacting how our children learn, and therefore impacting how we live in society. Diné people were systemically round up. This massive warfare, this scorch and burn policy destroyed our lands, and the U.S. cavalry effectively rounded up our people to the point where we were genocided to about 8,000 people. They were sent away on what is called the Long Walk to Bosque Redondo in 1864. During that time, they spent 4 years in poverty and almost starved. It was literally like a concentration camp. In 1868, we signed the treaty. The treaty allowed us to return to our ancestral lands between the four sacred mountains of Diné. In that treaty, we were allowed to return to our homelands, but that wasn't the end of colonization. Colonization still enacted itself and produced conditions for it to keep working within our communities. We have things like the Livestock Reduction Act, where in the 1940s, Diné people their food sources were targeted by the U.S. government. The U.S. government said that we were overgrazing our own lands and that they needed to come in and kill off our food sources. And so that was a major event where many of our livestock were systemically destroyed. This is a type of its own violence in which you create a dependent economy, a dependence on the trading post system, on all these different foreign foods, flour, sugar, all of these things. You remove people from their traditional means of sustenance.
So the issue surrounding the 30-meter telescope and Mauna Kea is really complicated, and it has a really long history, and I'm certainly not an expert on that issue. And there have been people who have been fighting telescopes being built on that Mauna since the 70s or the 80s. But most recently, for the last, God, has it been 10 years? We've been fighting a particular telescope, the 30-meter telescope, from being built on the summit of that mountain. This telescope, I believe, is something like 18 stories tall. The 30 meters describes the size of the lens. It requires digging into our sacred mountain for like 3 or 4 stories. So by all intents and purposes, it requires an act of desecration to build this telescope, and that's one of the really serious arguments against it. But the other really important argument against this 30-meter telescope is that the state of Hawaii, the University of Hawaii, and the conglomerates that have invested in this 30-meter telescope do not have the jurisdiction to build or to propose such a project on our land. Because of the illegal overthrow, the faux annexation, joint resolution in 1898, Hawaiians still maintain our political sovereignty. And in many ways, legally, the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. And so the folks who make up the 30-meter telescope, they should not be negotiating with the state of Hawaii. They shouldn't be negotiating with the University of Hawaii, who claims to hold the master lease. But rather, this is an issue that Hawaiians should be able to decide on. What's built on our lands, how things are built on our lands, who makes those decisions should come to Hawaiians, because our autonomy as a sovereign people legally still exists. And so this issue is not just about the sacredness of that Mauna, but it's also about the political autonomy of our people. And it's an issue of sovereignty. And so the state of Hawaii, this past October, the Supreme Court handed down a decision to honor the lease and the permits for TMT to be built. And so in the coming months, there will be another confrontation on the mountain between Kia'i, protectors of the mountain, and construction workers, because the Kia'i have the Kia'i have committed to continuing to protect that mountain. So only time will tell exactly what that will result in, but there's no reason to believe that our people are going to stand down to this issue.
I examined the history of Oranga Tamariki. Most people think that it originally established here in New Zealand. But my research indicates something else. It was originally established in England by a group called the House of Commons Select Committee on Aboriginals. Now, they're a very powerful group. They were established in 1837. They're made up of government officials and religious organisations, mainly Catholic and Anglican. And their role was to push forth the idea of Christianity, the idea of British citizenship, and how they went about establishing this was through the development of assimilation templates. And they had to do this because the British Empire, they colonised more Indigenous countries than any other European power. And so as a result, they had to set up this assimilation template and then apply it right across the Commonwealth. And so as a result of this, they established the Aboriginal Acts in Australia, they established the Indian Acts in Canada and USA, and they established the Native Schools Act 1867 and the Neglected and Criminal Children's Act 1867, here in New Zealand. And so what that means is this. It was the House of Commons Select Committee on Aboriginals who established the stolen generations in Australia. They established the residential schools in Canada and USA. And we know that right now the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is dealing with the fact that over 6,000 children have gone missing, and they're still missing to this day. And here in New Zealand, it is the House of Commons Select Committee on Aboriginals who made it illegal for Māori to speak their native tongue. And they used corporal punishment as a vehicle to assimilate Māori children away from their culture into Western civilization. And what they also did was, in the establishment of the Neglected and Criminal Children's Act 1867, that became the predecessor for the SIFS Act 1989 that we know of in New Zealand. Well, they're using Section 78 of the Oranga Tamariki Act under ex parte. And what that means is this. It means that they can get a court order from the family court without the family being there. They can make allegations against that family. They have no legal counsel to hear. They're not even part of the process. And if the information is deemed to be sufficient, the baby can be uplifted, without the knowledge of the mother, father, or family. I take issue with it because of this reason. I believe that it is a breach of the Bill of Rights Act 1990. In Section 24 it states this: if you're accused of something, you are to be promptly notified of what that is. Section 25 says this. Number A, it points out that you have the right to a fair hearing. C points this out. You have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. Point E says this. You have the right to be at that trial, and you have the right to prepare a defence. And the last point says this. You have the right to question the prosecution's witnesses. Now, these things are not happening.
We have to remember, though, that racism is not the shark, it's the water. It's the system that we live in. So I experience it every day. So we learn to be resilient, we learn to fight back, we learn to be persistent, we learn to not pass it on to our children. So the missionaries brought us the written word. They brought us a new way of being. And for some whānau, well, it's really interesting. In my own whakapapa, my ancestors were part of that first wave of Christian conversions that came through Waiapu. And at that time, it was seen as a way to save our people from war, to save our people from disease. But again, it came at a great cost. It cost us sometimes our tribal connections as we moved to become part of something that was pan-tribal. It cost us our connection to our traditional karakia and our traditional motiatia and our traditional gods and the way we operate. It changed the way we see women. You know, before Christianity, women were powerful. The ability to give birth, to menstruate, all those sorts of things were held in the highest regard. They were tapu, they were powerful. The Christians came and suddenly women are dirty, women are less. The very things that make us powerful are somehow profane. So it had a huge impact on our mana wahine, had a huge impact on who we are as women and how we're perceived, even by our own tāne, you know, as they took on these new ways of being. So it's had a huge detrimental impact on how we are able to operate as women in our own world.
Māori experiences child abuse is a direct result of the Native Schools Act, 1867. Before that, there are many cases that have been documented from Dr. Rawiri Taonui. He talks about whakatauki, proverbs, that talked about the codes and the ethics of looking after our babies. He also talks about Samuel Marsden, where they are, his recording says that Māori were tender fathers. Dr. Moana Jackson says the same thing. Also, Dame Anne Felland, she looked up writings of members from the crew of the Endeavour, and what they talked about is the tenderness of the fathers. And so the pre-colonisation, it very clearly highlights that Māori were tender to the upkeep of their children. Where did it start? And so when you look at the Native Schools Act, our kaumātua and queer experienced corporal punishment to such a degree, even more disastrous than what's been recorded. But the intergenerational ripple effect it had to the next generations of families, children's, stems from that. So what I say is that you take a stone and you drop it into a pond, it creates ripples. If you think of the 1867, the Native Schools Act, as a stone dropped into a pond, it's creating intergenerational ripples. And so what that means is this, those ripples, they become visible, and they are, in the likes of Nia Glassy, Delcelia Whitaker, Lelibing, the Kahui twins, James Whakaruru. It doesn't give any excuse for what happened, but what it does, it gives a historical context. And so what I've come to understand is this: Māori experiences of child abuse is a contemporary outcome of our colonial legacy.